The U.S. president parroting Russia's lies this Wednesday night. The deepening rift between Ukraine and its most powerful ally.
He lives in this disinformation space.
And the concerns among Ukrainians in Canada.
What he wants to do without Ukraine, it's insane.
Fresh promises of a high-speed rail network between Toronto and Quebec City.
It'll turbocharge our entire economy.
The questions about whether the project will be full steam ahead or a political train to nowhere. And the Pope's health, how he's doing after being diagnosed with double pneumonia.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The future of Ukraine is further in doubt because of the American president. Tonight, Donald Trump said out loud what he wrote in a scathing social media post filled with falsehoods that he posted this morning. Trump insulted and threatened Ukraine's president.
And the only thing he was really good at was playing Joe Biden like a fiddle. He played him like a fiddle. That's an expression we use, yes, sir, to say that he's pretty easy. A dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left.
Questioning the legitimacy of Zelenskyy and Ukraine itself has long been Russian President Vladimir Putin's line. If anyone is a dictator, it is Putin, who has made himself president for life and has not held a free and fair election in years. And Trump is parroting another Kremlin line that Ukraine started the war when it is Russia that is clearly the aggressor. Jackson Proskow has our top story on where this could be leading.
With a stalemate on the battlefield, an information war has become the newest front in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
It started after U.S. President Donald Trump falsely blamed Ukraine for the conflict, words that echo Russian propaganda. Unfortunately, he lives in this disinformation space, said Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. I would like Trump's team to have more truth. On social media, Trump spread more lies, calling Zelenskyy a dictator without elections. He suggested the Ukrainian president is just in it for what Trump called a gravy train of American support.
Many of the statements that we have heard over the last 2 days are not new to us. We have already seen them and heard them on Russian channels.
If Trump really is demanding new elections in Ukraine, opposition MP Kira Rudik explained that would be nearly impossible in a nation still at war.
Ukraine is a democratic country, and neither Russian president nor the president of the United States will tell Ukrainian people when to elect our president.
Yet the U.S. and Russia shut Ukraine out of a meeting about peace talks. Nobody is excluding Ukraine from this process, claimed Russian President Vladimir Putin. European leaders and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met virtually Wednesday to discuss the jarring new reality.
It's a fundamental principle for Canada and for the vast majority of our allies that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
Nearly 3 years into the war, Ukrainians can only hope that Trump's talk is just that, and that the U.S. won't back down in the face of Russia's refusal to leave Ukraine.
We hope that, and it's hard to say, but the reasoning and that truth will prevail.
The signs from Washington are in fact confusing. Trump's special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, is in Kyiv and was blunt about calling Russia's actions an invasion. Kellogg also said he plans to convey to Trump the need for security guarantees for Ukraine. Donna?
Okay, Jackson Proskow in Washington. Jackson, thanks. Canada is home to the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world. More than 1 million people of Ukrainian descent live here. Nearly 300,000 people have arrived since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. After almost 3 years enduring Russia's aggression, listening to the U.S. president blame Ukraine is hard to take. Heather Yurix-West has been hearing from some Ukrainians in Canada.
This family dinner is one of Slava Slez's last peaceful memories in a country she holds so dear. Taken in the Ukrainian village of Teniv just months before Russia's full-scale invasion, when their lives changed completely.
My sister right now in Kyiv with her son, and they just every night, couple times a night, they go underground. they terrifying.
After almost 3 years, Slez says everyone wants the violence to end, but not at the price the U.S. president is now proposing.
We want peace, we want to have fun, we want to raise kids, but that what he wants to do without Ukraine, it's insane.
Well, I feel mad, actually, because this is, it looks at least like a betrayal, big betrayal.
For Olha Kolibanic, Donald Trump's comments blaming the war on Ukraine cuts especially deep. Not only did Russia's invasion force she and her husband from their home, she also lost her father, killed defending his country on the front line.
It happened in September 2022. Unfortunately, he was killed.
The community is very traumatized by all of this. We were really hoping for a lot. And today what we're hearing is, for Ukraine to surrender and to give up its fight for its freedom.
It's a painful path to a possible peace for people who have already suffered so much. Heather Yurex-West, Global News, Calgary.
One more note about President Trump. On his social media platform today, he likened himself to a king as he celebrated his administration's move to kill New York City's congestion pricing program. Congestion pricing is dead. Manhattan and all of New York is saved, he wrote. Long live the king. The White House then reinforced that message, recirculating it on Instagram and X with an illustration of Trump wearing a crown on a magazine cover that resembles Time but is called Trump. There was a big promise from Canada's Prime Minister today. Justin Trudeau announced plans to build Canada's first high-speed rail line. It would run along a corridor between Toronto and Quebec City, and trains would reach speeds of up to 300 kilometers an hour. If it sounds familiar, it's because versions of this idea have been floated and studied many times before. We'll look at the politics behind it in a moment, but first, Eric Sorensen explains the plan.
Imagine this kind of speed getting around on a train in Canada. A huge upgrade on the passenger trains that exist today. Prime Minister Trudeau says it's finally coming. A rail service called Alto, a public-private partnership with electric trains on new tracks that will reach speeds of 300 kilometers an hour.
A reliable, efficient, high-speed rail network will be a game changer for Canadians, slashing travel times by half.
It's a great investment. It's a transformational project. The project is going to stimulate the Canadian economy. We need that big time.
If it happens, the newly built rail line will span 1,000 kilometers from Toronto to Peterborough, Ottawa, Montreal, Laval, Trois-Rivières, and to Quebec City, where close to half the Canadian population lives. A big hurdle will involve acquiring the land needed, but the economic impact would be enormous. Federal investment in the development phase of $3.9 billion over 6 years. During construction, some 51,000 jobs will be created. And when it's operational, an estimated boost to GDP of up to $35 billion annually. Plans going back 30 years looked at faster rail service from Windsor to Quebec City, but
it's going to take a lot of work to get there.
Political inertia and high costs always kicked those plans down the road. Now, with U.S. threats of high tariffs, a made-in-Canada mega project could tap Canadian resources.
That's steel, aluminum, copper, resources we have that we can use here in Canada.
We need to sort out very quickly is how we're going to stimulate our own economy with the uncertainty that we have. And this is probably the biggest ticket project we have to do that. So the calculus of this entire project and this conversation on high-speed rail has completely changed the last 2 months.
Canadian rail projects like the LRT in Ottawa, the RAM in Montreal, and the still not operational Eglinton Crosstown in Toronto have been beset by either cost overruns or delays or both. But at Montreal's train station today, some passengers are all for high-speed rail.
Montreal to Toronto in about 3 hours.
Wow, that's perfect. Love it. I really need that.
Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
To consider the politics behind this, our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson is with me. Mercedes, we know there's widespread agreement Canada needs high-speed rail. There have been multiple studies and planning phases over the years. Nothing has been built, though, often because of politics and money. There's no budget or timeline for getting this one built, so am I wrong to be skeptical?
I wouldn't call it skeptical, Donna. I would say you're being realistic. This is a project that is at least 4 to 5 years away from any kind of construction, according to the government's own timeline. That's more than a full election cycle away. And what was announced today was more aspirational than concrete. And at this point, a lot of government announcements fall into one of two categories. The first one is announcements that are effectively election promises, since we'll have a new prime minister within a couple of weeks and an election expected shortly after that. Or there are also category two, legacy projects for the Prime Minister and his government. Now, as far as election promises or legacy projects go, this is not a bad one. There is widespread consensus that Canada needs high-speed rail, and the events south of the border have made it clear that Canada needs to look internally for investments to address trade, industry, the need for pipelines and transport. Expect to see a lot more east-west discussion and projects in the future rather than simply north-south. Trump's tariffs on top of this make it a good time politically to announce this for the federal government, as well as the vote-rich areas that it will address in both Quebec and Ontario. And the public might be in more of a spending mood for national infrastructure projects, given what's going on. But the reality check here is in the timeline. Canadian steel and aluminum need help now, not in 2030, which is when the parties talking today see construction starting. And the government isn't showing a particular rush to get this project completed, rejecting definitive timelines or benchmarks. The next government will decide whether to support this project. In the past, high-speed rail has had bipartisan support, including from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So if you're hoping for high-speed rail, perhaps it's more likely now than at any time in the past, but realistically, it's still a very long way off. Donna?
Okay, and just for the record, I love trains. Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa, thanks.
They're fun.
High-speed rail has been around since the 1960s. Japan created the first one. The so-called bullet train now operates over 3,000 kilometers of track there. China has since outpaced every other country, building the most extensive high-speed rail network in the world. It has an operating network reaching over 40,000 kilometers. And in Europe, where rail travel has long been popular, Spain, France, and Germany have some of the largest high-speed networks in the world. In Toronto, all but one of the 21 people sent to hospital after Monday's crash landing at Pearson International Airport have now been released. All 80 people on board survived. Most of them were able to walk away from the fuselage that had flipped upside down. Cranes are now at the airport, and crews are slowly removing some of the wreckage of that Delta Airlines flight. The task for investigators is to determine how it happened. Sean O'Shea reports.
2 days after it crash-landed, the plane's final approach has been seen around the world.
Everything, drop it!
As well as how passengers escaped in the minutes that followed. 80 on board, all survived.
We train for this continuously. The fact that they were able to evacuate that plane as expeditiously as they did under extreme conditions, and it's because we train for events.
For investigators, a wealth of evidence to examine.
We have passengers that can talk about the landing. We have the crew who can be interviewed. And so it helps the investigators get their job done.
They now have the all-important black boxes in hand.
We've already removed the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, and we've sent them to our lab for further analysis.
Flight data may reveal what the video does not. It's expected to be crucial in determining what happened. David McNair is a retired 30-year TSB investigator and military pilot.
The aircraft shows us crossing the threshold at about the right altitude, so that's normal. But then it descends and doesn't round out or flare, which normally when you get to the point you want to land the airplane and land it smoothly, you pull back on the elevator and then that arrests the descent rate. That didn't seem to happen.
The vivid images of the crash landing could be a cause of worry for nervous flyers, but
It's nerve-wracking, but we'll be fine.
Accidents might happen sometimes. That's how it is.
These things happen, and if your fear takes over you, then you won't get out of the house, right?
The fact that people got out all right could make people feel more confident about flying, says this psychology professor.
Maybe even when the worst happens, the worst doesn't happen. So maybe that's a silver lining in otherwise a very threatening situation.
Life-threatening, but a crash with an unexpected outcome. The fact that everyone got out alive. Sean O'Shea, Global News, Toronto.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says she is removing her Deputy Minister of Health from that role after allegations of political interference surfaced. But she is pushing back on calls to hold a public inquiry. The Premier maintains she had nothing to do with awarding lucrative medical contracts in the province.
I was not involved in these procurement decisions. I had nothing to do with the process decisions or the implementation. If mistakes were made, they will be corrected.
In a lawsuit, the former head of Alberta Health Services alleges she was fired for investigating questionable contracts pushed by government officials. The Premier says her government is seeking an independent third party to help with an internal review. The federal government has bought 500,000 doses of a vaccine to help protect people who are at increased risk of exposure to bird flu. The Public Health Agency of Canada says 60% of available doses will go to provinces and territories. The remaining 40% will be stockpiled. The risk to the general public from avian influenza is low. The Public Health Agency says there has been no evidence of person-to-person spread in any of the cases identified around the world. Burglars busted coming up. Who's been charged in a spree of thefts targeting the homes of pro athletes in the U.S.? Two people have been arrested after a quadruple homicide on Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation in Saskatchewan earlier this month. The RCMP says an 18-year-old has been charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Another young person is expected to be charged later today. 4 people were found dead in a home on February 4th in the community that's about 80 kilometers east of Regina. The RCMP says they were shot and that it was not a random act of violence. Police believe the victims were targeted. Police in southern Ontario have charged 8 people after a year-long investigation into an auto theft ring in the Hamilton area. This security footage shows some of the thefts. The suspects range in age from 19 to 43. Police say the thieves operated at night, targeting high-end vehicles and in some cases using devices to steal key fob signals from inside homes. The cars would be loaded into containers, most sent to Montreal to be shipped overseas. Others would have their identification numbers altered and they were sold in Canada. Police say they recovered 200 stolen vehicles and returned them to their owners. In the U.S., 7 men from Chile have been charged after a spree of burglaries targeting the homes of professional athletes. NFL stars Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce were among the athletes hit with break-ins. Some NBA and NHL players were also victims. The group is accused of stealing valuables worth over $2 million. It's alleged some even took pictures of themselves with the stolen goods. Each person faces up to 10 years in prison if convicted. The criminal sentence for a leader of the so-called Freedom Convoy, what he's been ordered to do. That's just ahead on Global National. A key organizer of the so-called Freedom Convoy that took over the streets near Parliament Hill in 2022 was given a 3-month conditional sentence today. Pat King was also given 9 months credit for the time he's already spent behind bars. It is a much shorter sentence than prosecutors were calling for. Mackenzie Gray explains the ruling that King is celebrating as a victory.
A jubilant Pat King outside the Ottawa courthouse. Thank you, Pat! Along with his supporters thrilled that the convoy kingpin has avoided going back to jail.
Was he found guilty of mischief? Absolutely. But he was not such a mischief that he should be sentenced for what everybody else did.
A view shared by Justice Charles Hackland, who handed King 3 months house arrest, 100 hours community service, and 12 months probation for 5 guilty verdicts, including counseling mischief. Somebody say freedom! For King's role as an organizer of the Freedom Convoy. Despite King's frequent presence on the streets of Ottawa, Hackland said he was only a periphery leader and could actually be credited as a positive influencer of the protesters because he told supporters to avoid violence and obey the law, even though he made statements like this before the convoy.
Trudeau, someone's going to make you catch a bullet one day.
King did not testify at his trial, and his probation officer felt he accepted minimal responsibility. But on the final day of sentencing submissions, King apologized, saying he can relate to what downtown residents experienced during the weeks-long gridlock, something Justice Hackland accepted. King delivered an emotional and, in this court's view, a sincere apology to the people, a position this Ottawa lawyer disagrees with.
It would be right to be very dubious about whether Mr. King really feels remorse in his heart or, has said words that he thinks would and ultimately did help him in court.
The sentence was much shorter than the 10 years the Crown was seeking, Donna, but the lead prosecutor tells Global News they're considering an appeal.
Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mackenzie. Praying for the Pope next, what the Vatican is saying about his health. The Vatican says the Pope has shown a slight improvement, but he is still in the hospital in Rome and is being treated for pneumonia in both lungs. There is no timeline for when the 88-year-old might be discharged. Redmond Shannon reports on the well wishes being delivered from around the world.
Wednesday in the Vatican usually means an audience with the Pope, but not this week.
Even though we cannot encounter him directly, but I think to remain with him in prayer, that's more important.
Pope Francis has been in hospital since Friday with a respiratory infection. His condition since diagnosed as pneumonia in both lungs, involving more than one type of infection, a situation doctors call complex.
Con questo forte raffreddore.
At an audience earlier this month, he apologised for what he called a strong cold that made speaking difficult. The 88-year-old has been dealing with a series of health issues since he became Pope 12 years ago, including flu, back problems and a hernia operation in 2023.
There has been a sense for some time that the pontificate is slowly drawing to a close.
Pope Francis has signed a resignation letter to be read if he ever becomes impaired for medical reasons. A renunciation precedent set by his predecessor, Benedict.
We don't know what will happen if Francis's condition deteriorates, but he remains short of death. That, I think, is a significant concern for some people right now.
On Wednesday, Francis received Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who said he was alert and joked with her. And later, the Vatican said the Pope's condition showed a slight improvement.
I'm praying for Pope Francis. We came here to Rome to be near him.
Prayers that the world's most prominent religious leader will recover to guide his church through this Jubilee year, celebrated by Catholics as the Year of Hope. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
That is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is the Blue Mountains in Ontario. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to globalnational@globalnews.ca. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.